Welcome to the daily, or excuse me, thank you for joining me today. Not the daily wrap up, 7 days straight, and that's what it'll do to you. But thank you for joining me today. I have honored today to be joined by James Corbett to continue my focus on this topic in regard to Occupied Palestine and the larger conversation about what's going on in regard to Hamas, in regard to civilian populations, and really just diving into one main point today, which is in regard to the possibility of whether or not this was something that was allowed to happen. It's going to possibly upset a lot of people. The idea is that this is something that is being put forward by a lot of people in Israel, a lot of citizens of Israel that seem to believe that their government was behind something. Whether allowed to happen or whether heard of it, we'll discuss, and you guys can come to your own conclusion. But I think it behooves us to consider possibilities, especially when it's so emotional. So thank you to James for joining me today. I think this is an important conversation. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me on. It sounds like there's a weird glitch on my side where you seem to be kind of stuttering electronically. Am I coming through okay for you?
You said okay. Let me know in the chat if the audio is coming through or not. We've already had a couple weird gremlins before we got started, so let us know. But thank you for joining me, James. I know you're busy. I wanted to go through a lot, a few things that tie into this larger topic that I've already covered on the show, and I want your thoughts on it in general. But I think today I really want to focus on that larger topic. And one thing that I wanted to say before I started is those that maybe not have seen my work before or James's coverage in general. We always put out in front the concern for the average person, the civilian, the people without a voice. And I think that's important to make it clear that in nowhere we should diminish or ignore the suffering of anybody on any side, be that civilian or a military member. But one thing I think important, and I've been saying a lot, is if you're in a field journalism and you're going to put aside your emotional reactions while doing due diligence, then you probably shouldn't field. And I think what's the problem now is that we've been discussing the topic, whether or not there might have been some involvement. Throughout history, especially with the United States and in Israel, it's a very, very big topic. It upsets a lot of people as if we're trying to attack the suffering that they feel people have gone through. And I think what is important to point out is if that's the way this is supposed to go, then people will always be outraged about what they're supposed to happen or they think happened. The implication is that we're supposed to not investigate people no longer emotional. And I just think that if easily abused power. And even if not, it's something that ends up being, saying that there is some echo. That's quite frustrating. I'm not even sure what to do to fix, but I guess going and I'll try to angles and things on the side here, but apologize for that guy. He's saying reset the connection. Doesn't surprise me. Well, James, give me your thoughts on just I'm going to throw it to you for about a second so I can fill this. On the general topic of what's going on right now and why you think it's important. And I'm going to start is going to be around the idea of the civilian casualties. And I'm going to specifically in regard to Gaza, but in general and the statements that have already been by people in power in Israel very clearly that this is not just about us. This is about Palestinians, all civilians. And that's been stated repeatedly. So what are your thoughts on that as I try to figure this out?
Okay, yes, it's important to set the table for this conversation in that way because, well, actually, there's another aspect of this. And before we launch into this conversation, let me preface everything that I'm saying today by noting that it is absolutely first thing in the morning here in Japan. So I have just woken up and just gotten into the news feeds. So whatever major developments took place in this story overnight, I'm not going to be up to speed on all of them. But actually, I mean, even the question of, well, I'm halfway around the world in a completely different time zone should be an interesting intro into this conversation, because I want to start by saying, for anyone who's wondering why an American in America is talking to a Canadian in Japan about what is happening halfway around the world. I know one of the reasons that you invited me on is I know that people in your audience have been asking for you to talk to me about what is going on right now. And I appreciate that. I genuinely appreciate that people do appreciate the work that I do and the way that I do it. And I understand the sort of vote of confidence that is, but I don't want to be taking away from the voices of the people who are actually there and actually living this experience. So I won't go so far as to say that people's time would be better or more fruitfully invested in listening to people like Ramzi Baroud, actual Palestinians, or people like Robert Inlakesh, who I know has family and has lost family in Gaza. People like that who have are absolutely involved in this situation in a more real and present way than either yourself, Ryan, or me. But at any rate, I just want to put that out on the table. I know, and we are venturing into territory that is deeply, deeply emotional right now, which is, of course, part of the problem. And as you say, I think if we want to enter into the plane of morality, to have a conversation in which morality plays any role whatsoever, we have to acknowledge that the wanton slaughter and murder of innocent Israeli civilians is a moral disaster, is disgusting. In the exact same way that the wanton slaughter of innocent Palestinians is disgusting. And for the extremists on either side of this issue who says there is no such thing as an innocent Israeli or no such thing as an innocent Palestinian, you do not cross the threshold of entering into the moral realm, and this can be simply excluded from this conversation.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that too. I hope it sounds better. Let me know in the chat, James Lowe. But I'm glad you said, because it's very, very important to. And again, that's where I'm going to start, because it's really. I mean, honestly, it's kind of thrown me for a spin here to see people, even people that I respected, who have taken a really unending line in this. Where there's only one side of this conversation, right? And I've been trying that clear on many different sides. It's not even just two. There's people all different perspectives seem to think that only their part matters. And I quite frankly think this is because of the power and people in the governments and the propaganda that spins people emotionally. But I know time is limited, so I'm going to go ahead and get into some stuff to begin. What I want to start with. Oh, and I did want to say one other thing is the reason, your point, the reason that I wanted you to come on. And yes, I was probably contacted by 5 or 6 people to ask you and I to have this conversation, but because you have done a lot of really excellent work when it comes to false flags in general. So you have a really understanding of the earmarks and what you can things up better than most argue. So that's why your perspective. So I'm going to try to go quickly through the stuff because I want to get right to the conversation. But let's start with a couple of things. I just want people to see. I think are important to make clear and understand, and maybe I'll kind of cut some out that we don't need to go through, because I've got a lot of examples. But first and foremost, I want to start with coming directly from the Associated Press. This was just put out in general. This coming from Gaza Health Ministry, but it's been reported by UN, by the Cradle, by a lot, even corporate media have cited the numbers of 724 children and 485 women as killed in Gaza, and separately from that is 1,500 Hamas militants. I think it's very important to recognize that what we're talking about here is comparing to 1,300 at the moment is Israelis that have been killed. Some of them definitely IDF members. The other side of it, Hamas members, 15. But I want us to recognize, and this is not to make one side or one life more important than the other, that at the moment we have about the same amount of just women that have been killed in Gaza because of the bombing that's going on there. Compared to what happened in Israel. And I think that's an important point to see as this continues to go forward. And the reason that's important for the conversation today is wondering whether or not the point indeed about doing something like this in Gaza, finding a rationale. And I think that's a point in regard to historical statements and so on. And I also just to show now in general, as of right now, total in Gaza 2,329, Israel 1,300 is the number from the original incursion. Know that there are supposed that are going to be repeated based off identification is what I'm hearing from the Israeli. Now, and feel free to jump in, James, if you have any comments. I'm hoping this sounds a little bit better now. I'm going to start with a clip here from CNN. Is unnerving to say the least. Where they're admitting that at this moment about essentially admitting that this is about starving the civilians or to have an effect on Hamas, essentially, or the ruling faction. And this is interesting because this is much like sanctions that we talk about, how they're playing these in order to hurt this population in order to get a response. And I think that's always what it's really about. So here's what Ben said today.
Does that mean, does that mean starve the Palestinian people, continue to, because they will be so hungry and will be so desperate for water and medicine that then they will give up Hamas?
It sounds callous, but I mean, this is a war.
But
so just that statement. What thoughts on that, James? right? The idea that 30 years ago it was something that depends. It's the same game as being played in the media, where if one does one thing, it's freedom fighting, the other side does terrorism kind of game, right? Now you're rationalizing in real time collective punishment, right? I just think that's very telling.
Yeah, I mean, that's blatant, absolute war crime. There is no doubt about that. There's no putting any kind of gloss on it. That is, by any standards that have persisted for at least the last century or so, that is an international crime and should be prosecuted as such in any rational or sane world. But of course, we do not live in a rational or sane world. So that is the kind of thing that can be freely floated on the airwaves, CNN and otherwise. So. Not surprising in the least. It's in fact actually pretty much the status quo that we have, certainly I've seen all of my life, and I presume most of the people in the audience have seen, that there is some sort of strange other world that exists in Israel that allows them to commit war crimes and things that would be absolutely recognized as genocide if they were committed by anyone else, but apparently not when Israel does.
Right. Now let me know if you guys can hear me. Switch to my it's less, but at least it's hopefully not as bad.
It sounds good now.
Good. So I mean, again, to reiterate why I think it's important to demonstrate, because I'm not trying to suggest that action by Hamas are seen differently, but I've seen like your point from the beginning, people that are arguing that it's justified of X, Y, and Z, and it's the same kind. The reason that I'm trying to point this out now is because the logic and the point of discussion is about the false flag, and then realizing that they will level from the institution and be willing to hurt people to get that done. And that's no different than, in my opinion, the U.S. government or pretty much in the world. So this isn't, that's make it clear why we're focusing on that point. Now, here's another example. This is from a CNN interview, and this is actually really telling. That a IDF member, I think it's a IDF, speaking with CNN and saying deliberately. And actually, he even says, I tried to correct you, and let me tell you now, it's a fight against the civilians. And I'll play that really quickly, and you can, if you want to comment, go ahead.
Correct you to the answer. The war is not just with Hamas. The war is with all the civilians.
So the point is, the video is longer. And I have the version right here for those that don't. The point is, he then goes on to say, it's 8 minutes long, that it's because the civilians hate us. So there's no real kind of context after that makes it any better. Point is, he's making it very clear in his mind, because the civilians hate them, that then they're a fair target. And I think that's an important context for us to understand. And then more examples. Here's a reasonably famous 95-year-old reservist, Ezra Yachin, who is by terrorist group from the Zionist group, but openly states everybody part of the group that we have to kill every single one of them, the last man. Here is a open written Haaretz article from mainstream Israeli media. Killing children brings Israelis together. I just saw that. I didn't believe it was real. Read this. It'll for interest of time, I'll go over it in a few. You would like me to go into it, James, but it's pretty shocking. And it literally says that killing children, much as it may be a bad thing, is good because it brings together and it shocks people and it makes a difference. I just want to make sure people see that kind of mentality. It's really alarming. I know we got limited time with you, James, so I'm going to go ahead. I'll revisit this on a show coming up, guys. Robert, making sure we understand the child death toll in Gaza currently is a child death toll according to the entire Ukraine war at the moment. And as I understand from I think Eva Bartlett and a couple of the sources they in currently just and then over the one entire year in Afghanistan. These are all stats coming from high level different reports coming out. Here is the Israeli president saying deliberately, openly, that all of them are bad guys. Every single one of them. I'll play this one and then we'll get into the main topic, James.
Operating militarily according to rules of international law, period. Unequivocally. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up. They could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
So I guess only one nation gets the right to fight, and so on. So we see here the reality that in their mind, the rationale, all the citizens are involved, which then makes it clear why there's discriminant bombing taking place. Right. So I think important in general. Now I have a couple of examples of the other politicians opening that exact same point. A policeman that says we should turn Gaza into dust. A politician that's been calling for nuclear bombs to be in the area. It's all really unnerving. There's been as of today, 14 members of the UN killed there, 400,000 people that are hurt, which they're not allowed to, they're not able, but they're claiming they're going to bomb the area anyway. It's a really unnerving reality. The UN's been calling it out. We have blatant, even the Human Rights Watch now acknowledge that there was proof of white phosphorus. So it's been this unnerving, just onslaught on Gaza. And yes, what happened in Israel was disgusting and terrible, and definitely a war crime. But no way we need to have both these conversations in our mind at the same time. It's both of them can be terrible at the same time, not one versus the other, right? And it's just this ongoing attack that's becoming hard to watch. So this is where, all that being stated, Dan Cohen pointed out, it's very interesting that in March 2023 they put out the article, the Times of Israel. We will retake Gaza, and it will come with many casualties. And it's a very interesting article that ties back to a lot of policy and direction that was planned out. And so, first of all, my thoughts on all of this before we get into this kind of stuff about the fact that there seems was insight, people warning that what are your thoughts on the logic of I wasn't showing it, but the logic of trying to take back Gaza? Like, do you think that this is something that the Israeli government wants to accomplish? Do you think this is something that they would be willing to opinions in about creating justification to do so? I think we know that in the past they've had examples of the U.S. government carrying out flags and so on.
Right. I think the old adage that people have when it comes to personal relationships is that when someone tells you who they are, believe them. So when officials and others make statements that we will retake Gaza, and if it involves ethnic cleansing and genocide, then bring it on. We should believe them when they say that and take it at face value. So yeah, I have no reason to distrust that this is something that at least certainly not every single person in the Israeli government, let alone every Israeli citizen, but certainly large sections of the Israeli government are 100% on board with this idea and this agenda of wiping out Gaza to the last man. And we're starting to see that coming to fruition on the back of this highly suspicious event.
Right. And, I mean, I don't really think we need to, I think it's very clear that there's been a desire to, I mean, back to the original occupation itself, the whole point was about moving this society aside to take this territory, whether or not you think that's justified. So coming to today, the question becomes with this event that took place, was this something that they would have been willing to allow to happen or be a part of to take further action in Gaza, which I think that alone is a hard sell, because I don't think they've ever really needed any justification to ultimately take action in Gaza in the past. But this is where, and let's just go with this. We'll start here and give me your thoughts on this. This is Efrat Fangenson she served in the IDF in intelligence. And here's what she has to say about her thoughts on how I guess the word she uses was possibly sacrificed by the Israeli government.
Possibly explain such a failure. Incompetence seems inadequate to explain it. Now you're in a position to say more about this because you have manned that border.
Yeah. It's very hard for me to talk about it because it's there are so many friends and family members of friends that are missing and have been taken hostage in this barbaric acts, that talking about what I know sometimes feels like, why is this important now? And at the same time, I know that if we don't talk about this, then we will just let them off the hook once again. Because to me, and I will explain why I think this is a great atrocity. Because to me, this is, it's, I don't know how to say it. It's just the people of Israel have been, I don't know if sacrifice is too rough of a word, but we have been sold and sold out completely, and no help for hours and hours, and no military involvement, no police, no arms on the ground for hours and hours. This is something that is non-typical and unusual for Israel Defense Forces. Now, I've served in the military forces 25 years ago as I was in the intelligence forces based in the Gaza Strip, as I told you. And I know the security drills. When I served, there was no internet. So I would sit next to the phone in my shift of the fence of the security of the Gaza Strip. And whenever something would move alongside the fence, I would get a phone call from the human observers that are looking at the gate, telling us there is a chain of command that you have to notify when something like this happens. And then straight away, forces come in to look at what is it and take it down.
So what do you mean when something moves by the fence? How small is something?
It can be a pig. It can be a cat moving alongside the fence or touching the fence or trying to cross the fence. An animal, they would identify it. They would see it.
A cat gets scrutiny.
Would trigger. Yeah, it could trigger the fence. Yeah,
and
an animal.
25 years later, with
25 years later, with internet and with the most sophisticated high-tech weaponry systems, and there are drones and there are helicopters and there are troopers on the ground, and there are many things that are supposed to be activated. There are various lines of defense and layers of defense that are supposed to be activated when something like that happens.
Okay, so I just want to make this clear. I mean, it probably is, but you have a system that is sensitive to anything the size of a cat or bigger. That system, since you were manning it, has had 25 years to mature and become more sensitive, to become more discerning. And yet, how many places was that border breached?
15.
15 places
if not more. Yeah, 15. And that is completely ridiculous, because normally with one breach of the fence, the whole army is triggered. And things start moving immediately. Things start moving immediately. And here there was nothing for hours.
So that's 15 places, right? I mean, we know the Iron Wall conversation. We know there's been nothing. I mean, there's been a conversation about maybe this was a lot of bluster in some cases, right? But from my research, that doesn't seem to be the case, right? So just based on that sentiment, and I'll get into some it seems like a waterfall people online from Israel that are challenging U.S. sentiment, saying you're wrong. This did this to us. What is your take on that? What do you feel about that?
Well, I think that clip certainly speaks volumes about because this is the type of excluded part of the conversation that, because it is not presented to people, they generally won't think about. But yes, if you have experience in security services of any sort, let alone in that particular situation, you will know that what happened is not just unusual, it is unthinkable. And the most interesting treatment that I've seen of this so far in the mainstream world is from the New York Times, which had a story up the secrets Hamas knew about Israel's military, which is an interesting article. It starts by saying the 10 gunmen from Gaza knew exactly how to find the Israeli intelligence hub and how to get inside, which right away, the Israeli intelligence hub. There's only one hub that monitors the border, apparently, and it's a little room with a bed inside of it and a couple of guys there, a couple of IDF manning it. And these guys knew exactly how to get there, and they shot everyone on sight, and they got into the room and killed the guys there. And we know all of this because of the footage from their helmet-mounted cameras that they were wearing, and they were later shot. And so don't worry, the New York Times has seen the footage. So apparently this is the explanation. And they go on to say that that these Hamas fighters had color-coded maps of exactly, like, not just the general area, but the hub itself and exactly where it was located and how to access it, etc. But they don't really explain how this planning document, which found by Israeli emergency responders in one village, quote unquote, how it came to be, how they have this kind of color-coded map with all of the secret access and ingress and all of this. And the document is dated October 2022, suggesting that the attack had been planned for at least a year. All right. Okay. Your lips to God's ears, New York Times. I just have a few questions about this and how this plan was developed and how it came to such startling fruition, despite, as we've just heard, the incredibly sensitive, constant surveillance and monitoring of that border. And as I believe she goes on to say later in that interview, we're not talking about 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 different breaches of that border. We're talking about 15 breaches, and not a single police officer, military person in sight for hours and hours. This is impossible in any other day or in any other circumstance. It's unthinkable what happened. So we have to think about how it did happen.
And I would go further and say that's almost, I would say, I rarely use the word, I don't like the word, I think anything's possible, but the unlikely, thinkable in any circumstance. I mean, think about any secure location where you could people 15 different locations simultaneously. I mean, that doesn't even make sense to me. There's something, and to point here is, this is something I haven't confirmed only in the sense that the same way I would say I haven't been able to confirm the New York Times, their claim about that video, right? This is just, it's the Iranian Tassim agency making these claims. So take that for what you will. I would argue Iran plot, I mean, any corporate news outlet, I think or any news outlet for that matter, has an interest in trying to convince people of their narrative. But here's what it says. The Iranian Tassim agency, citing its sources in the Palestinian resistance, that parts of the Israeli regime's army forces collaborated with the Gaza resistance in transmitting information about the state of the army. Sensitive area directed Palestinian forces during their penetration. So that would, if that's the case, that would explain why all that stuff happened, right? And here's where it gets even more interesting. Well, first, again, these were the kind of small notes on the side. This is from the 12th. Israel had intel activity, but didn't put it on high alert. Sort of 11 feel right there, right? Like before. Egypt warned Israel days before it happened. This has all been, even though both of these claims were disputed in the beginning, now it's come to be reality. And I'll come back to that in a second. The other point I was going to get to was like this kind of stuff, right? So now the Israeli population, for those that don't know, the reality that Hamas was, I mean, I would have created by the United States and Israel, which I think you can really prove. Even Ron Paul said that in front of Congress a while back and all the documentation. Their own population is saying this. For years, Netanyahu propped up Hamas. Now it's blown up in our faces. And so you start to see the kind of outlines of the possibility of something that was used, just like people have made the arguments before in regard to even just rockets with Gaza. The idea that there's been articles written about that, how oddly enough, every time there's an election or every time there's a problem, there's suddenly a surge in the issue. And so there's a lot of opinions coming from within the Israeli population, which I think very important to understand how that plays. And then even WikiLeaks cables pointing out that the Israeli intelligence chief encouraged the Hamas takeover of the Gaza. And this goes on to be clear about the reality that gives them the excuse to do what they want to and so on. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I have some thoughts. Yes. So as I'm sure you've seen, many people have been calling this Israel's 9/11. And I want to say, okay, let's take that statement. But let's not take it at face value, because of course the face value reading of that statement is that just like on 9/11, we were attacked out of the blue by these dastardly terrorists, and thus that gives us carte blanche to go on a never-ending war against anyone we don't like, right? That's the sentiment that is obviously being called to mind when they call this Israel's 9/11. But let's take it from the conspiracy reality perspective. That of course 9/11 was not some random attack out of the blue, and it was not by random terrorists. It was obviously part of a much larger intelligence operation, as has come out. And I have attempted to document in many documentaries over the years. So let's look at the aspects of this event that line up with that 9/11 parallel. You have the surprise attack out of the blue from the air, nonetheless, by these paragliding Hamas fighters. Okay, sure. And as we've already talked about, 15 separate breaches of the border. Absolutely, completely unthinkable on any other day, but it happened. Just like on 9/11. The most heavily defended airspace in the world over Washington, D.C., completely undefended. Oops, we got a bunch of fighters over here looking after the Russians. We got a bunch of fighters over here on training operations. We got a bunch of fighters that we scrambled and then for some reason sent out over the Atlantic before they came back. And, wouldn't you know it, none of them could reach any of these targets on time, right? That's the story.
They claimed the West Bank was the earliest excuse was West Bank drew people away because of some issue, but 15 points, not buying it. Please continue.
Yeah, exactly right. So again, yet another parallel. Oh, it was just so much chaos and we just couldn't figure out what to do. So, all right. Okay. So, and now let's look at the explanation for this, because of course on 9/11, we know it was the dastardly Al-Qaeda terrorists masterminded by that arch terrorist mastermind in the caves of Afghanistan, using his satellite phone and laptop, directing 19 men with box cutters, right? That's how it happened. And here we have, of course, these Hamas terrorists. Well, okay, let's look at that. Al-Qaeda, of course, as people know from my 5.5-hour documentary on the history of Al-Qaeda at corbettreport.com/Al-Qaeda, if you're interested, founded in 1988, right? And Hamas founded in 1988. And by whom? So, of course, Al-Qaeda and all of the various links to intelligence, the CIA, etc., as I've talked about in my work in the past. Well, let's look at the Hamas situation. And as you've already pointed out there, it's not even a conspiracy theory at this point. It's openly talked about. People could have at the very least at the time pieced it together by reading between the lines of opinion pieces that ran again in our good old favorite, the old gray lady, the old great prostitute in the New York Times back in 1989. You had Clinton Bailey, for example, writing an alternative to the PLO fundamentalists, in which, of course, he's putting in black and white the rationale behind this and explaining the rise of fundamentalists in the Palestinian camp, essentially, and how they could be useful in negotiating in negotiating a different way and putting pressure on the PLO, of course, at that time run by Fatah and Yasser Arafat. And he goes on to say, thus, if America and the international community decided to concentrate their efforts on implementing Security Council 242 with an Israeli-Jordanian accord, they might find the ground largely prepared in the Palestinian camp, ironically, by Islamic fundamentalists. Moreover, the fundamentalist emphasis on regaining whatever territory they can might leave room for compromises with Jordan that the PLO could not allow itself to make. So, at any rate, we're getting the groundwork preparation in the public consciousness for the eventual reveal, which did happen many years later. Yeah, Israel definitely helped foster and bring Hamas into reality. A good overview explainer of that from the Washington Post, the CIA's favorite newspaper from 2014, how Israel helped create Hamas. But that references specifically the Wall Street Journal article that I'm sure your listeners are familiar with by now, How Israel Helped to Spawn Hamas by Andrew Higgins, that ran in 2009, quoting Avner Cohen, who a Tunisian-born Jew who worked in Gaza for more than 2 decades, who said, Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation. Right. And they go through the history of that for people who are unfamiliar with it. Now, of course, as you have been at pains to stress in your recent coverage, and I commend you for your recent coverage, you've been doing incredibly important deep dives on this. So I hope people in my audience are listening to your daily wrap-ups on this. But as we stress, there are many different ways that we can read, Hamas and what it is and how it has developed over the years. And it isn't necessarily the case that Israel literally controls Hamas and everyone who is in Hamas and tells them what to do. And this was all 100% a made to happen sort of event. There are many ways that this could work. In the same way, I would suggest, again, if we're going with the 9/11 parallel with Al-Qaeda, which I call Al-Qaeda advisedly and for obvious reasons, but it doesn't mean that every single person who thought that they were joining up to the Al-Qaeda terrorist organization and swearing their allegiance to Osama bin Laden necessarily knew that they were working indirectly for American and Israeli and Saudi intelligence. I don't think that that was necessarily something that they told to every single member of the organization. In the same way, an organization like Hamas could be puppeteered and controlled from key positions by people who are actively collaborating, whereas there are other people who genuinely are true believers. And in fact, if you were running an operation like this, you would want that specifically. And if people can't wrap their minds around the calculations that go into this, I'm recently rereading Danielle Ganser's NATO's Secret Army about Operation Gladio, and it explains it very clearly in there about how the most beneficial way to create a force of terrorist fighters is to recruit people who genuinely believe what they are doing and genuinely are trying to do it, but you're steering them this way and that, and you're allowing this or that attack to happen. Anyway, that's sort of the overall false flag idea and how this type of event could be the result of collaborationism between certain elements of Israeli intelligence and military and certain elements in Hamas, for example. Again, I don't have the receipts and paperwork on this, but I just think that given the incredibly, not just unlikely, but well nigh impossible events that we've seen taking place, that would be a very, at least an option that should be on the table for people to consider. And let's extend the analogy out, because of course, what was the 9/11 op really about? I mean, there were many different things that came about as a result of it, but one very obvious thing that you can point to is pre-9/11, 2001. I'm sure the Americans in your crowd will remember George W. Bush, an incredibly divisive and largely reviled figure. Even Republicans weren't necessarily jazzed about George W. He was a laughingstock and the subject of a lot of protests. Post 9/11, 2001, rally around the flag. He's our war leader. Rah, rah, go America. And that lasted for several years before the shine of the beautiful, glorious attacks of 9/11 started to wear off and people started to recognize the reality. Similarly in Israel, Netanyahu, a deeply divisive, deeply unpopular figure. And just a couple of months ago even, you had IDF reservists and others leaving or threatening to leave and stop service because of the types of changes that the Netanyahu government is trying to make with regards to the Israeli high court and the way that it functions and parliament's role in this, blah, blah, blah. Domestic politics, guys. But at any rate, Netanyahu deeply unpopular with a large section of the public. But guess what? Of course, in the wake of this, rally around the flag, guys. Do not question. And exactly as Efrat was pointing to earlier, well, I know this doesn't make sense and there are questions about it, but should I even be raising these questions at this time? That's the exact sentiment that people had in the wake of 9/11. It's weird, there's some things here that don't add up, but you don't question it. Do not question this event. And I think that it's having the similar effect. Other knock-on effects that can happen as a result of this. One thing that I noted right away, one of the things that was floated in the first couple of days of this was how did this attack happen? Oh, it's because those dastardly Hamas terrorist masterminds went dark. I.e., of course, we can control and surveil absolutely everything that they are doing electronically, but they just didn't use electronics, man. They were doing face-to-face kind of meetings. So what is going to be the result of this? And I mean, at the very least, let's imagine, okay, Israel says, okay, guys, let's not do the ground invasion. Let's stop bombing. Enough is enough. Okay, we're going to let up. But at the very least, you would imagine they would set up the ultimate surveillance dragnet. You want a smart city? Imagine what they're going to do to Gaza to make sure that anyone that says anything, any blade of grass that moves will be constantly surveilled and etc. And exactly as in the case of 9/11, where that type of Homeland Security Patriot Act nonsense then spread to the entire world, essentially. It has become the groundwork infrastructure for what Colin Powell later identified as the terror industrial complex. Well, boy, did the terror industrial complex just get a giant shot in the arm, so to speak, from this event as well. There are many aspects to this, but I think that the parallel is there. This is Israel's 9/11, and I think that's intended in every possible way. And just as a bonus, of course, we recently had Netanyahu himself coming out and saying Hamas is ISIS. Right. All right, Hamas is ISIS. Who is ISIS, and how did they come? How did they arise from the sands of the desert? How did they arrive on the scene? Oh, that's right, in that spectacular convoy that paraded across Western Iraq there in 2015 under the watchful eye of the U.S. forces, of course, and completely allowed to go in and take Ramadi and other parts of Western Iraq and into Syria, exactly as was predicted years in advance by the Defense Intelligence Agency, saying, you guys, with what we're doing in Syria and Iraq, this is going to cause an Islamic State. And hey, the Islamic State arose, headed by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who, for people who don't remember, had that remarkable career. Arrested in Iraq in 2004, rearrested in 2007, arrested again in 2009, killed in May 2009, killed in 2010, arrested, died in an Israeli hospital in 2015, killed in an airstrike in October 2015, killed by the Russians in 2017. But don't worry, he's really dead this time. And then finally reported dead for the last time in 2019. Anyway, people know the nonsense that goes on in this sphere. And so if you want, Netanyahu, if you want to say Hamas is ISIS, let's see where that idea goes.
Well, let's not forget that has been, on the record, treating extremist ISIS members in Syria. There's that the Heights area. There's just like medically treating them. There's been this coverage that's very clear. And then to your work in general, or even Ben Swan has an outstanding documentary to tie directly back to the Israeli government connections. So it's kind of ridiculous that now they created Hamas, and now he's tying that together, and that's kind of like too much on the nose, right? It's like that's very clear here. But I want to make some points, like you said. I think it's important. That's important. That's why I started and if it wasn't for the time and the audio issue, I would have done a little more focus there. But the idea that that's what, like, the idea that people are afraid to talk about this, even though she clearly feels there's a problem, and even maybe I shouldn't, and that's my point about this. Get that people are emotional, but facts matter. Obviously. And if that fact might even change how you perceive who's responsible, wouldn't you want to know that? A lot of people, I argue, probably wouldn't want to know that, right? So I think that's important. And the same reason I started with the idea of, showing you the focus on children, the bombing, and so on, is just to go over the logic about why it seems this might be something that they're capable of in regard to who they're funding and creating, in regard to what I'm talking about, the Zionist government and the funding of through Hamas. Make theirs interesting, that we know the origin, but then the question becomes, what happened? It seems that something shifted, right? Vanessa Beeley points out that there are still provable, in her opinion, connections in Hamas to still some loyalties and connections to Israel, and even to the United States. So the question is, were there possible actions that might have acted outside of what they were really doing? And I actually really quickly wanted your opinion. So the 2006 election was what everybody kind of points to now, acting like, well, Hamas is the government of Palestine. And it's obviously not that simple. And it's not even close to, I think, the reality of where it currently is, right? We know that that's the last, we know that there was the Fatah kind of like forth between Hamas and Fatah, and then the agreements, and it kind of stalled, right? So what, in your opinion, how do you frame that? Who would you argue is more in charge of what's going on in Gaza specifically? Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, how do you see that? And then who do you think it's fair to say that they're the government of Gaza, in your opinion?
What does government of Gaza mean in the situation of a military occupation? To a certain extent, the entire thing is a charade and a game. So that there is support amongst people in Gaza for Hamas. And I don't mean everyone, but that there are people who would support Hamas. Definitely. Would not be surprising, I think, in this event. But I think perhaps the most fruitful way to understand what is happening right now is not as a war, because wars happen between nation states, right? That's not what's happening right now, is it? What's happening, essentially, did we just witness a jailbreak? And if we did, in that context, what is the situation? In a sense, if, as many people have come to understand and acknowledge, Gaza is the world's largest open-air prison, with 2 million people being held in captivity, essentially, and utterly controlled from outside, then what they're doing is not deciding on some sort of government in some sort of free and fair election for their nation state. At best, they're getting a suggestion box for prison warden. And the prison warden in this case, well, it's become Hamas. And there could be different reasons for that. One of which is, I mean, do we trust that this is the free and independent selection of the will of the Palestinian people?
I don't know how it's possible.
Yeah. Exactly. But that some people might think, okay, well, we want the big, strong, guy with a big stick to be the warden, at least to keep away I mean, what is the analogy here? The people in the outside world who are trying to come in and control the prison. I mean, it kind of, the analogy breaks down to a certain extent, but that some people might think that it makes sense and sort of plays, again, on the lived experience and reality of people who have been under siege and occupation for decades, and whose very existence in this region has been nullified for the better part of a century at this point. Try putting your head in that headspace and see what you come up with regards to that. As I say, whether Hamas is a functioning government that has been chosen by the Palestinian people or something, it seems like it's the wrong way of even conceiving of what's happening in Gaza right now. And just to expand the conversation a little, because of course Palestine does not equal Gaza. I mean, let's talk about the West Bank. Let's talk about other aspects of this, the Palestinian diaspora that exists. And let's also talk about Egypt's complicity in making sure that border is controlled, and that they've said they do not want people fleeing over that border. They've shut it down to anything but emergency aid. So Egypt has a role to play in this as well, obviously in collaboration with Israel. And that is actually, I think, sort of the base of this issue, is that the Palestinian people, as always in these conflicts, become nothing more than chess pieces for a geopolitical power game that is taking place right now. And of course, the Israeli strategy, if they can, is to just get rid of those chess pieces. If that was possible, if they could just drive them into the sea, as you were pointing out earlier, there are many officials who openly say that at this point. And similarly in the Arab world, you Palestinians, you represent our presence there in that region. You have to stay there and defend our land. We're willing to fight to the last Palestinian, says the Egyptians and other people in the Arab world, right? So again, the people, the actual human beings, 50% of the 2 million people in Gaza being children, are being used as chess pieces, and it's absolutely disgusting. And to the extent that any life, Israeli or Palestinian, is just being used as convenient chess pieces to hold different squares of the grand chessboard, that's something that we have to reject completely and wholesale, because that mentality, as we saw even with Efrat, they're talking about, well, the Israeli people are being used by their government and their military. And so let me say the most controversial thing that I hope will get the extremists on all sides extremely angry with me. But Ryan, allow me the space for a dramatic pause here to give this the full extent of what I mean to say. I stand with the Israeli people. And I stand with the Palestinian people. I stand against the Israeli government. I stand against the IDF. I stand against the settlers and others who would literally cheer as they watch the bombs dropping on Gaza. I stand against any actual true Hamas terrorists who would gladly slit the throat of a little Israeli child because they're Israeli. I stand against the Canadian government, the Japanese government, the American government, the governments and the authorities that seek to rule over humanity. I stand with humanity. And if we don't come at this from that perspective, again, I do not think we enter the realm of even having a moral conversation.
Yeah, 100%. I really think that's where, the vast majority of my coverage has been really trying to focus on is the obvious problem with civilian general in this conversation, where we're trying to compare. I think Nawaz. I forget. I think I've always trouble with his name. I'll include him in the. He made a great point about how it is that you basically have two extreme sides. This dead child proves my point. No, this dead child proves my point. And it's just we've lost all sense of what makes, what's moral. And that's probably largely at least one of the points in all of this. I think I'm glad. I appreciate your framing in regard to Gaza, or in regard to Hamas and the government there, because what's funny is it's such a breath of fresh air to talk to somebody who can stand back and see the dynamic there that you explained, and it's so frustrating. But you're absolutely right that it's not even a fair starting point in the that we're talking about an illegal occupation. We're talking about people that have been occupied for 75 years, 5 years plus, hold atrocities. So, I know I had a few more things I wanted to get into, but I think that's a generally good place to put a pin, because I know it's left. But why don't we end with, if you could give your of as much as I know it's a very reality for those that know the legalities of, but it's very clear that it's an occupied territory. That anybody would even try to deny blows my mind. It's legally the reality, the UN, but people still make that argument. But can you break down the legalities of the Geneva Convention and arms struggle and what that means in the context of what's happening right now for people just about why some people think that May is trying to kind of rations the violence, but there's a line there between the act of rebellion and then crimes that were later committed. So give me your thoughts on that to kind of wrap today.
Right. Well, I do not have the references pulled up, and I know you've been talking about this, so I will again direct people to your daily wrap-ups where you're going through this in much more detail than I will be able to do extemporaneously here. But yes, the general point is that people who are under occupation, military occupation, are generally understood to have the right to resist that occupation by any and all means, including the use of deadly force.
Within the law.
Now,
yeah,
to a certain extent, okay, yes, let's go by Geneva Conventions and UN statements, etc., because this is what is generally understood and recognized as international law. However, I would say the deeper issue is that I think the whole construct of international law is itself the stepping stone to world government that is lusted after as part of this larger globalist agenda. So I certainly don't want to say that because of this convention or because of this UN statement, they have the right to resist. I think the general principle is that people who are under military occupation, essentially, as I say, if you are being put into an open air prison, obviously against your will, and being held there and then being threatened with ethnic cleansing / genocide, yeah, I think the basic moral precept of self-defense definitely comes into play. Of course, then the question of what constitutes self-defense, and does slitting the throat of a child constitute self-defense? Of course not. So it has to be placed into that context, and there are still crimes that can be committed in the act of self-defense or rebellion. But these are things that are, as I say, basic precepts of morality itself that don't come from the United Nations or any particular convention. They are part of the human experience. At any rate, it is a point oft made, but let's make it again. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And it is generally a question of history being written by the winners. So that George Washington and the other rebels are heroes and are venerated as founders of the nation because they won. And if they had lost, I wonder how history would look at even the American Revolution, right? So this is the key point. People who are fighting in an existential struggle. This isn't just about some sort of patch of land or something. This is about their right to exist on the planet. It definitely brings with it the right to self-defense. And as you have pointed out, of course, the very same people who talk, for example, about the Ukrainians' right to self-defense against the Russians will then go out and say, we stand with Israel. And anything that they do, including ethnic cleansing and genocide, A-OK. Anyway, I don't even know how to speak to people who would deny that there is an occupation going on. Again, I don't even know what to say, because that's not even entering into the realm of reality to have a reality-based discussion. This is a military occupation, and at the very, very, very least, the expectation must be that there will be armed resistance to any such occupation like that, even regardless of the moral question. And I think that's the other aspect just before I have to get going here. But the other aspect of this that's important to think is what possible, if this was a genuine, authentic, organic attack by Hamas, and Hamas has nothing to do with Israel, and they're completely 100% the will and representative of the Palestinian people, and this was a totally organic attack, what was the strategy here? What was the point of any of this? Okay, a spectacular, amazing, the biggest breach of Israeli intelligence in the border in the history of this conflict, incredible victory, I guess, if you want to put it in those terms for that side. Great, wonderful. So the idea is to go in, kill as many civilians as possible, kidnap the rest, and then just retreat, and then just sit there and wait to be invaded, which apparently seems to have been the strategy at this point, or at least that's all we've seen. The only things that I could think of is it is an attempt to break the status quo, which I guess mission accomplished, but which way is that going to go? Not necessarily well for the Palestinian people. Or it was obviously not an authentic, organic, completely 100% Palestinian plot. It was a collaborationist plot. Or maybe an accelerationist plot to, okay, now we're going to get Iran and other people into this conflict, and there's going to be a bigger war, and that will settle this issue once and for all. But anyway, as some sort of military tactic, okay, let's do this spectacular invasion and then come right back and just wait to be bombed. Doesn't seem to make any sense from any perspective I can see.
Yeah, well said. I agree. And I know you got to jump out, James, so go ahead. And if you're going to drop out, I'm just going to end in general. So thank you all for being here. I apologize for the issues to start and before we started and during the show with the audio. I'm wondering whether the audio was actually just that bad and there was some chat issues, and I jumped in and screwed it up with this even further. So we'll find out. I'll see what I can do to fix it. But I think it's really important to continue to be clear. Civilians matter anywhere. Whatever their ethnicity, where they're from, whatever they look like, that has to matter. You can't pretend that your outrage somehow outweighs their right to be alive. And it's really becoming how many people can't wrap their minds around that. Thank you for taking the time, James, and I hope everybody continues to question all of this and come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.